document will be a living thing and we'll create updates over it over time. So especially if there are questions that you find that you scores. And along the way, I'll share a little bit of new information about that. So if we start off looking at how individual questions scores are calculated, there's two ways that we do this. So some questions have objectively correct answers. Think of something like a multiple choice question. You either select the correct answer or you don't. And those scores, or those questions, you get a point for answering correctly and no points for not answering correctly. It's an objectively scored question. We also have partial credit questions, and some of these award scores based on the quality of the response. So it's not really whether you've given an objectively correct or incorrect answer, but it's about the quality of your writing or your fluency or your pronunciation. So these can be scored across a range of score points. And two really important things to remember for questions that are scored based on quality like that are things called content and formal requirements. So some questions, for example, the essay question, will have a requirement for content and for form. Content requirements are about the relevance of a response and the appropriateness of the response to the prompt. So if a test taker provides an answer to a question that's just completely off topic, they've not actually attempted to answer or provide an authentic response, then they're not providing enough content for us to actually score. And what that means is they'll be scored 0 for the whole response. The same is true of formal requirements. So different question types might have different formal requirements for how you respond. And that really has more to do with the structure of the response itself. So if there's a requirement for a certain word count, for example, if you don't meet that word count, then you'll receive 0 score for that response. It's important to remember that these requirements exist, and you can find all of them in the score guide. So there's a score guide for test takers that includes all of the scoring criteria for every question type in PTE. And you can learn more about the different content and formal requirements in there. But it's important to know, because even if you write an essay that scores highly on some of the criteria, like grammar, for example, you'll actually get a score of 0 for the response if you haven't met the formal requirements or the content requirements. And the reason that we have these kind of requirements in the test is because we need to make sure that people are providing enough of an authentic response for us to score. And if they don't provide enough evidence for us to score, then there's no point in giving a score to that response. So this is just to say there's a minimum threshold you have to hit in order to receive a score for a response. So definitely recommend, especially for people who are newer to PTE, to take a long look at the score guide document. So that's how individual questions are scored. But how do we actually create overall scores or skill scores based on that? So I think there's an assumption that we just add up all the score points across different questions, and that total score gives you a score out of 10 to 90 on the PT academic scale. But it's actually not quite that simple. So scores aren't just based on the score points that test takers achieve, but we also take into account the difficulty of the questions that they sat, or the difficulty of the questions they answered, and the weighting of those questions. So some questions have more weighting, more importance, more emphasis in scoring than other questions. So I'll take these each in turn. So we have score points that you achieve on different questions. We look at the difficulty of those questions themselves. So we can determine the difficulty of questions by pre-testing. So we know before anybody ever sits a PTE test exactly how difficult every score point is on that test. And we use this information to make sure that we are creating comparable or similar levels of difficulty, comparable test forms for everybody. So we take this into account to make sure everyone's getting a similar level of difficulty in their test. And then we also take into account the difficulty of individual questions when we're creating overall scores. And the simplest way to think of this is if you imagine that both Magda and I were to take a test that had 10 questions in it. and we both got 9 of those questions right. But it turns out that Magda's questions were just a little bit more difficult than the questions that I got right. Is it fair that we're both given the same score at the end, exactly nine points? I would argue that it's not, that actually Magda's demonstrated a little bit higher ability in answering her questions than I have in demonstrating mine. So this is just a fact of how all English language proficiency tests are. Some questions have a little bit more difficulty than others. Everybody strives to create tests that are of the same level of difficulty, but every single test will have a little bit of variation. And so what that means is when we're scoring, we take that into account when we're scoring people, that we're adjusting or taking into account difficulty when we're estimating somebody's ability level. Then the last part of that puzzle is we also look at the weighting of the questions. So certain question types are weighted to make sure that we have this representation of real world communication skills in the test, so that there's emphasis on the skills that really, really matter. So you'll see later, I'll talk about how different question types are weighted, and that gives you an idea of what's being emphasized in scoring and what carries a lot of importance in scoring. So I mentioned this, that there's these 3 pillars in scoring: the actual performance, the difficulty of questions, and the weighting of questions. I mentioned this because number 1, I think people assume that it's just simply adding up points, and that's not the case. And number 2, it's because we do this to create the fairest possible scores. That lets us create scores that are equivalent across really large groups of people taking the test. And it's a more advanced and nuanced way of producing a fair score on a test than just simply adding up points. It's also important to know that we're actually calculating overall scores. I wanted to touch on the point of integrated skills. So if you're brand new to PTE, integrated skills means that sometimes we assess more than one skill with a specific question type. So let me just get my laser pointer out and I'll show you. So we have some questions like read aloud, which counts towards the overall score, and it counts towards the speaking score. So that's not an integrated skills question. It only counts toward one of the skills. But we have other questions that count towards more than one skill. For example, repeat sentence. So this is where they listen to a sentence and then they have to repeat it out loud. Those questions count towards the overall score. They also count towards the listening score, and they also count towards the speaking score. So that means integrated skills might count towards, or do count towards more than one of these scores. So when we're calculating the overall score, that's based on every single response in the whole test, every question in the test. When we're calculating reading, that's based on every single response, every question in the test that counts towards reading. And you can imagine this as if you took a test that only included these question types, where there's a tick by them, your score there would be your reading score. So it's completely separate. We're calculating reading just based on those question types. And same is true for listening. You could imagine that you've just taken a test that has the question types that has the tick mark by it. Your performance across those question types, that's your listening score, calculated completely separately from everything else. Same with speaking and same with writing. So I'm explaining this because it has something to do with why the overall score is not an average of the 4 skill scores. And that's because we have integrated skills, and these questions count towards more than one skill score. So if we were just averaging up the 4 skill scores, those questions would be double counted in our averaging, right? Because you'd be averaging listening scores with speaking scores, and they both already have this repeat sentence question as part of their calculation. So what that means is the fairest way for us to calculate an overall score is just to count every question once, and your performance across every question on the test, that's your overall score question, or your overall score for the test. So I hope that's clear. If you do have questions, please pop them in the Q&A section, and either Magda will answer as I'm speaking or I'll answer at the end of the session. But the important thing to remember is you can think about each of these scores as what your score would be on the test if you calculated it based on different subsets of the questions. And the most important thing to remember is that overall score is not an average of the 4 skill scores. It's just based on your performance on every question on the test. And it's a separate calculation from your scores on reading, listening, speaking, and writing. So that's how integrated skills work for overall scores. One of the other aspects that comes up when we're talking about how PTE is scored is the role of human raters in scoring PTE. So we've always had human involvement at different stages in PTE scoring, but from August of last year, we introduced an additional layer of human oversight in scoring for every extended response question. So what that means is these questions that have yellow highlighting, these question types, describe, image, retell, lecture, and so on, those are scored on different traits. They're all scored by the automated scoring system. So every question on the test is still scored by the automated scoring system. But for these particular question types, some aspects are also scored by a human rater. One of the questions I get a lot is, are human raters scoring just some of the questions or just some of the responses? Is it sampled? And I've even seen people really adamant that it is sampled. It's not possible for us to have humans score every response for these question types. So one thing to remember today is every single response for these question types that have some human scoring, every single response is scored by the machine, and it's also scored by a human rater. So it's not a sampled thing. It's not like we're doing 25% of the describe image responses are also scored by a human rater. Every single describe image question is scored by a human rater and the automated scoring system. And this column here tells you which aspects humans are scoring. So for everything highlighted in yellow, humans are scoring content as well. And then it's for the right essay question down here, it's content, development structure, coherence, and general linguistic range. So there's 3 aspects of human scoring happening here. So we've actually done this for a long time. We've always had humans involved in scoring aspects of PTE. They're all involved in training the engines. And we'd introduced this sort of human in the loop, human oversight element to scoring a couple of years ago for certain question types. And it's worked really well. It just gives us a nice sense check. And I think it gives people some reassurance that there's a human visibility of these aspects. And human raters and the automated scoring system agree as often as human raters would agree with each other. So it's just like an additional layer of checking, an additional quality assurance mechanism that we have. I can see some questions coming in to the Q&A on this topic, so feel free to answer, keep asking those as I'm talking. And in particular, we've introduced really some information about how different question types are weighted in the score calculations. And the reason we're doing this is because it just helps people understand what goes into a PTE score. Releasing this information doesn't compromise our scoring or make it easier for people to, recreate the scoring system. We still have a secure scoring system, even with releasing this information. But the main purpose of the information is just to help people get this feeling for what makes up a PTE score and try to demystify that a little bit. One of the other reasons that we are releasing the information is because I've actually seen quite a lot of misconceptions and inaccurate information about how question types are weighted circulating online. And a lot of this is in social media spaces. People will post that they think they've figured out the question weightings in PT Academic, as if they've sort of cracked a safe and figured out some information that we didn't want to release. That's not the case. We actually are happy to release this information. I think it's been surprising to see how many people have been creating their own versions of this online. We wanted to make sure we got the official information out to everybody. So if you ever have a question about how question types are weighted, you'll be able to refer to this document to see the official information about that. So there's been a lot of chatter on social media that's not had accurate information. We'd like to correct that. The other is there have been some misconceptions about just how scoring works in general. So some people might believe conceptions that people have had. I'm going to emphasize that this slide does not show how PT academic scoring works. This shows some misconceptions people have about scoring. So one of those misconceptions is that because we average the 4 skill scores, or they assume this, that they're all weighted at 25%, equally weighted. And hopefully everybody now knows we don't average skill scores to calculate the overall score. Overall score is based on all of the responses in the question, or in the test, all of the questions in the test. So skill scores or skills aren't weighted in this way. There's no weighting of skills. The other is that each of these question types is allocated to a single skill. So some people might assume that we don't have integrated skills scoring. This isn't true, and it's never been the case for PTE. PTE has always had integrated skills actually work in PTE. So this is actually how different question types contribute to overall scores and skill scores. So one thing to say straight away is I realize this is a difficult thing to see on a PowerPoint slide. If you go to the document that Magda linked in the chat earlier, there's a PDF version of this image, and you can zoom right in and it's very clear. So I know that it's not easy to see on a webinar slide, but just to walk you through what you see on here. You've got your overall score is this far left column, and it shows you all the different question types in the test and how much all of those question types contribute to the overall score. You see the same thing for listening, reading, speaking, and writing. But this can be helpful to visualize how integrated skills work a little bit. So if we look at a question type like summarize written text, you can see that's where my laser pointer is hovering right now. You can see that's how much 23% of reading and 28% in writing. So you can see that the size of those pink boxes we were looking at, they're proportional to these percentages here. So this can be helpful for people to understand what goes into a writing score, what goes into the overall score, and you can see how much each of these question types is contributing to those scores. That has to do with the amount of weighting those have, and also sort of the number of those questions that you have in the test. So describe image has quite a lot of weighting in speaking, for example, and that's because you have a number of those questions on the test as well. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit how these questions factor into calculating scores. But one thing I'd like to say, and make sure the message that we get across to test takers, is that it's still really important to consider every question type. Just because a question type has more weighting than another question type doesn't actually mean that it's a more important question for you to learn how to do when you're preparing for the test. It's important for people to have familiarity across all of the question types so they have the best chance possible to pick up as many score points as they can. I mentioned the skills profile. The skills profile is it lives in the score report that test takers can see. So institutions, governments, when you're applying somewhere with your scores, they can't see the skills profile. Only the test taker can see the skills profile. They can access it from a button on their score report. The skills profile gives a breakdown of different categories of skills and shows bars that explain how your strengths or relative performance in each of those categories. The one thing I really want everybody to take away is you'll see these bars don't have any numbers on them, and that's because they don't represent scores. So having a full bar doesn't mean that you've scored a 90 in open response speaking and writing. Having an empty bar doesn't mean that you've scored a 10. The purpose of these categories is really just to help guide test takers to areas they could focus their preparation on a bit more and their language learning. It doesn't mean that there's that they've gotten a specific score in these categories. These categories don't relate to specific scores. And that's how you can end up with a skills profile that looks like this. So you have a 90 in all of your skill scores and overall score, but this person didn't have a full bar in writing, or extended speaking. That can happen. That's because a 90 on the test doesn't mean that you've demonstrated perfect proficiency in something. It's possible that you can score a 90, but you could still improve your extended writing or your extended speaking. And if you click on these bars, it will expand to show some tips for doing that. So this can still be useful to test takers, even if they're just looking for areas to improve on, even sort of separate from retaking the test. But most important to remember that these blue bars don't equate to skill scores. They're just to help identify broader groups of skills that test takers can work on to improve their proficiency. And this chart here shows the different item types, different question types that relate to those categories. We hadn't released that previously, so this is also new information in the scoring document, and it's just intended to help people understand what the skills profile is telling you. So it can be useful to help test takers make sense of that. Let's move on to talk about post-result services. Because test takers often need a bit of help navigating post-result services, and this means they've taken the test and perhaps they want to challenge their score or have it reviewed. And it's important to know that there's 3 different avenues for people in that situation. And I'll draw your attention to this blue box at the bottom to say, in order for us to make sure that these services are all fair and to comply with different regulation where the test operates, we have to make sure that the same results, post-result services are available for every single test taker. So there's no special treatment or preferences given to people who get special exemptions. So it's important for us to make sure these specific services are available consistently across the board to everybody. So test takers can ask for a rescore of their test. And important to remember that if you ask for a rescore, your score could go up, your score could go down. That's very possible. When a rescore is conducted, it's done by 2 human raters, and they evaluate all of the open response questions. So all the questions that aren't automatically scored. 2 human raters evaluate them, and if they disagree, a 3rd human rater is brought in to adjudicate. And once the rescore is complete and the new scores are available, they overwrite the previous scores. So you can't roll back and you can't go back to your previous set of scores. You're just, this new set of scores is the final set of scores. We also don't provide any feedback on why scores changed. All you receive is the new set of scores. So this is the standard process for when a test is rescored. We also only allow each test taker to request this process once per test. So important to know, scores can go up, they can go down, they might remain exactly the same. I think it's important for test takers to know that they can go down, because I think some people request a rescore assuming their scores can only go up. That's not always the case. We also offer a technical review. So technical reviews really just relate to audio recordings. So if you think there was a problem with your microphone or the way that your spoken responses were recorded, you can request a technical review that will check to see if any issues with audio quality interfered with the scoring of your test. This doesn't check for other technical issues. For example, if your keyboard wasn't working or if you couldn't hear the audios in the test, those kinds of issues need to be reported at the test center so they can be sorted out on the actual day. Audio recordings for technical reviews are really just after the fact to see if there was an issue with scoring your audios because of the quality. So that can be requested as well. And if there's an issue found with audio quality, then we refund the test fee and the fee for the technical review. Then we also offer an appeals process. So appeals process relates to people who've already requested a rescore, already requested a technical review, or they received a malpractice decision related to their test. Those things can be appealed, and there's a process that checks all of the procedures that went through your original decision to make sure that all of the procedures were followed appropriately. So also for this one, you don't receive any feedback on any changes to scoring. It only checks that the actual process was followed correctly. So just important to know what these services offer and also what they don't offer, so test takers know what to expect when they're requesting them. I'm going to leave this question here for now. This is covered fully in the actual document itself, but this explains a bit more why scores can change sometimes when a test taker requests a rescore. Just know we're coming up towards the end of our session, so if you bear with me just one way from this session, I hope everybody remembers that one. Overall score is not an average. Overall score is based on every response in the test, all scored together. And it's calculated separately from your skill scores. All of these myths are actually in the document itself, so you can review them as well. So I'll skip over this one because we've already covered it. This one because we've covered it. We'll just do one more before we move to questions for the group. Skipping over these ones because this one came up this morning, so I wanted to make sure we covered it with this group as well. What do you think? Do incorrect answers make you lose points on PTE? So does anybody, if anybody wants to answer in the chat? I got this question this morning, and so I bet other people have the same question as well. So yeah, I think it's a tricky one to answer a little bit because I framed it as a yes or no question, but it's kind of not a yes or no question. So it's true that when you're doing questions like a multiple answer, multiple choice question, where you're asked to select all that apply, you get 1 point for selecting a correct option and you lose a point for selecting an incorrect option. That's true. But the caveat is you can never score lower than 0. So if these, because I'd like to answer your questions more than anything.
Agree.
And all of these are in the guide itself. If you have further questions that we don't cover today, you can contact regional sales team or master trainers. And if test takers have questions, you can